a cute message, preacher, but hey, look around. You look at my nation, look at my people, look at my friends, look at my family, look at the suffering that we're going through in the Midianites. Where have you been? And listen, so many of us, we ask some of the same questions, and yet it's really interesting here, kind of how God meets him, and really when you really look at the story, because so often, again, for Gideon, he was under the understanding that God had somehow abandoned him, that God had somehow walked away from him. And yet the truth of the story is, and to be honest, if we're honest tonight, some of our lives, the truth of our story is not that God has forsaken us, but that sometimes we end up forsaking him. We choose to go our own way. We choose to walk away. That's what we see in Judges chapter 6, verse 1 through 2. It says the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were incredibly cruel again, that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. I remember growing up, my pastor, he told me a story. Told the church a story that he actually shared a couple times. But he shared the story of this young couple in Oklahoma who were just sort of madly in love. And so every time he was a good old country boy, and he had like this red pickup truck, and so every time they'd hit the road, him and his girl, they again just madly in love, like they couldn't get enough of each other. So every time they'd hit the road, like she would scoot all the way over on the bench seat, and she'd just be right up next to him, like so close, like you couldn't even squeeze a baseball card between them. And again, it was just mad love. They would have done anything for one another. And as time goes on, they end up getting married, and it just seems like a storybook kind of relationship, right? Well, as time goes on, as the years go on, life happens, as it always does, right? And so life happens, and they end up running into some really tough times, some real tragic things in their life. They lose a child. He loses a job and has a hard time finding another one. And as a result, as the years go by, they just start to drift. They start to drift relationally. They even start to drift kind of physically. As now when they hop in the truck to go anywhere, no longer is she right up next to him. Now she's like all the way on the other side of the pickup truck. And so it was like this for about a year or two, actually, right after their marriage. And again, just that difference, that distance, until there came up a day where she just got tired of it. She's like, I'm just gonna lay the cards out. I'm gonna put it out there. And she goes, look, I'm just telling you, I don't get it. I don't get why there's a distance between us. I don't get, why you don't seem to ever, listen to me, why you don't seem to do this, why you don't seem to do that. I feel like you've forsaken me. And he just kind of looks over at her, and his response is classic. He goes, you know what? He goes, I ain't moved. I'm still driving in the driver's seat, and the only one that ever scooted over was you. I've never moved. And listen, I love this story because in a lot of ways, what God is speaking to Gideon and what God is speaking to us is the same reality. Listen, God has never moved. I know it might feel like, man, I'm going through some tough times and I'm going through some heartache. And it might feel like God is distant, that God has somehow forsaken you, that God has somehow lost track of you. Because listen, that's what the enemy would love you to believe. In fact, to get to the second part of this message, listen, you got to get this first part, which is the reality is that, listen, God has never moved. And if he's never moved, it means he's never left from your life. Listen, people will come and go. People will let you down. People will leave you. But listen, we serve a God that time and time again, when we read through Scripture, is faithful even when we're faithless. Even when we choose to go our own way, even when we choose to do our own thing. Hey, listen, God never leaves you. He never forsakes you. He's there. He's there. And I think, unfortunately, so often we mistake our choosing to drift or our choosing to go away from him as if God has somehow abandoned us. And even worse, even worse, when we do that, sometimes we mistake some of a viewpoint. In fact, I was thinking of this, my boy, before we played a scrimmage game last week, and we're hanging out, we're talking, and he's talking about how he's the great eight, and he's talking about how they're going to crush this team, and he comes out, and as he's talking, he goes, yeah, we're going to take it to my haters. I'm like, haters? Like, you're 8. Who hates an 8-year-old, right? Like, you can't have a hater if you're 8 years old. I mean, every kid loves you. I mean, at that age, right? And I think so often, though, it's like we sit there and we kind of take the same perspective of God. And I wonder if God kind of looks at us like that, like, hater, like, I don't hate you. Yeah, you might have slipped up, you might have failed, but that doesn't change my perception of you. That doesn't change my love for you. That doesn't change my presence in your life. And yet so often we sit there and we think, God could never love me. God could never accept me. God could never embrace me. And we create in our mind this distance between us and God. When God's in there speaking time and time again throughout Scripture, listen, I've never moved. I'm right here. I'm right here for you. And listen, you got to get this. You got to understand that God's presence, God's heart, God's love for you never changes because again, the enemy, one of the ways he loves to isolate you, and we talked about this some last week, is again, one of the ways is to try to get you to believe that God and others have somehow abandoned you. Because if he can get you to believe that God has somehow abandoned you, God has somehow forsaken you, you'll never be able to embrace the second part of this message. See, if the first part of God's message to Gideon had to do with his presence, the second part was with God's purpose for Gideon. And again, you can't even begin to accept God's purpose until you learn to trust and believe in God's presence. See, again, going back to Gideon in the wine press, people say that God doesn't always have a sense of humor. I would challenge that just on this story alone. I mean, again, imagine here's Gideon. He's hiding out in the wine press. He's scared for his life. And here's God showing up saying, hey, Gideon, I choose you, mighty warrior. You're going to deliver a nation. Go in the strength you got. And you can just imagine Gideon's like, whoa. Like, I mean, it's dark in here in the wine press. It's a dark pit. Like, you had the wrong guy. Like, there's got to be somebody else in this pit. There's got to be somebody else in here because you can't be talking about me, right? And really, I put in my notes this way, is that when you think about it, sometimes it's disconcerting when God addresses us because here's the thing. God has a tendency to address us based on our destiny, not our history, or even our current activity for that matter. Whereas what I love about this story is that we come to discover is that God's perspective of us is so radically different than our perspective of us. It's so radically different than the world's perspective of us. So you see, the world loves to label us based on our past history or our current activity. You'll always be a failure. You'll always be a drunk. You'll always be a mistake. You'll always be this or that. And yet how God sees us is so radically different. When God looks at us, I wonder for how many of you, your life and your purpose would radically change if you really believed that when God looked at you, he didn't see you through the lens of the labels that everyone else sees you, but he saw you as a mighty warrior. He saw you as someone that has incredible purpose and has incredible significance and has incredible plan and purpose in front of you. See, you got to understand that God's perspective, he doesn't see what we're not, but he sees what and who you and I can be in life. And this is so essential because really you want to get to the cure for insecurity? The cure for insecurity is right here. The cure for insecurity is understanding your true identity. That's to say, when you know who you are, it doesn't matter who you're not. When you really know who you are, it doesn't matter who you're not. And listen, again, we have an enemy who loves to get us to live in this constant place of somehow reminding you and trying to speak to you, you're somehow not good enough, you'll never measure up, you'll never have enough of what it takes to do this or to do that. But listen, when you're armed with the reality and the truth of who you are, it doesn't matter who you're not. And you might ask, well, who am I then? Who am I anyway? Well, you know what? Simply put, you're loved by God. You're loved by God. That's why he made you. That's why he saved you. That's why he died for you. That's why he placed this Holy Spirit in you. It's why he's placed a calling in your life. It's why you're loved by God. And it's so important because when you get that, you understand that we're not looking for approval for anybody because we already have the approval of the one who matters most. And that can change everything. See, when you face and you struggle with insecurity and you start to doubt who you are and who God's called you to be, listen, I really believe there's 3 questions you have to always ask yourself. The first question is simply this: who do I say I am? Who do I say I am? When you look in the mirror, who do you say you are? And again, like we talked about last week, you got to just get honest with that. You know, for some of you, you might sit there and look at yourself and say, I'm a failure. I'm a mistake. I've blown it this way. I just don't measure up. I mean, you got to get honest. You got to get real with it. But the second question, though, is you got to ask, who does God say that I am? So you ask, who do I say I am? Then you ask, who does God say I am? And then this is the third question: who do you believe? Who are you choosing to believe? Because who you're choosing to believe will determine everything about the life that you live. And think about this: who's more trustworthy, right? You know, who's the more credible source, you or God? My money's on him. That's why, again, it's so important. For the sake of time, I don't have time to go into the whole aspect of why it's so important to be in his word and to be reminded of the truth of who you are. But man, it's so essential. In fact, I do just want to give you one kind of verse that speaks to this reality. 1 Peter 2:9 says, you are a chosen people. You're a royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. He didn't create you to be in hiding. You're chosen. You're loved. He's got a plan for you. So you gotta get this. You gotta see, and when you doubt this, you gotta ask yourself, well, what do you feel? What does God say? And then you need to ask yourself, who are you choosing to believe? Oh, and by the way, here's one more thing too. When you're really wrestling with insecurity, again, I love that thing where it says you're chosen. In other words, God, he didn't get stuck with you. He chose you. You're adopted into his family. You're adopted. You're not naturally a born son or daughter into his family. You're adopted. You're chosen. Which, and I get some of the pushback. Well, adopted kids can have some insecurities too. Well, maybe, but you shouldn't. Because, think about this. If you're natural born, it's kind of a crapshoot, really. You don't really know what you're going to get. We had an awesome, amazing boy, but it's a mystery. You don't really know what you're going to get out of this deal. But when you're adopted, it takes all the mystery out of it. See, when God, by saying, I choose you, I adopt you, he's sitting there saying, listen, I know the good, the bad, the ugly of you, and I still choose you. I choose you. You're not some white elephant gift that like God somehow gets, and he's like, oh man, can I trade? He doesn't do that. He chose you. He sees value in you, your true identity as a son, a daughter, a child of God. That's the reality of you, who you really are, your true identity. And listen, getting back to why this is significant of stepping into your purpose is I put in my notes this way, is that you'll never be beaten in life by what you lack, but by who you won't become. You'll never be beaten by what you lack, but by who you won't become. Think of it this way. What's interesting about Gideon, and this is typically the part of the story where, and by the way, I've heard feels like 100 messages on Gideon over the past several weeks, and this is typically the part of the service and the message where it sort of becomes like pep talk mode. Well, like the angel of the Lord, by going to him and sitting there saying, hey, get in, you're mighty warrior, go in the strength you have. This is the part of the message where we sit there and would typically go, hey, look, you've got potential in you. You can do it. You can make it. God sees so much more in you than you see in yourself. And there's truth in that. But the reality is when God is calling Gideon to go in the strength that he has, he's not referencing Gideon's strength. He's actually, the greatest strength Gideon had was actually his weakness, not his strength. I mean, think about this. If God really wanted a warrior, if he wanted Thor to deliver the Israelites, don't you think he could have created and called Thor to deliver the Israelite nation? No, he chose a guy like Gideon, a farmer, scared half to death. I think to remind you and to remind me that, listen, oftentimes our greatest strength is not our strengths at all, it's our weakness. It's our vulnerability. It's our willingness to sit there and say, listen, I know that I can't make it through this issue. I can't make it through this circumstance. I can't make it through this addiction on my own. I need you, God. See, Gideon's greatest strength wasn't his strength at all. His greatest strength was, again, bringing it back to this first part of the message, was that God was with him. That he had a God who was fighting for him. And this is essential because so often when we're locked in insecurity, we can get so focused on ourselves. We can get so focused on when it comes to stepping out or trying to allow freedom to reign in our life and to really step into the calling and purpose God has for us. We get consumed oftentimes with what we can and what we can't do, as if it's all about us, as if it's all on us. But the truth is, and I put in my notes this way, is that insecurity, again, it can have this tendency to focus on my insufficiency instead of on God's all-sufficiency. And that's really what I believe that he's trying to get Gideon to see and trying to shift Gideon's focus, and I believe trying to get some of us here tonight to shift our focus on as well. And I get some of the hesitation there. Some of you are like, I don't know if I quite believe that. Well, look at the story. Look at the story of how this story ends, of how God would use Gideon to deliver the Israelite nation. Of course, again, they're going up against an army of 135,000. So he calls Gideon in chapter 7 to go and to deliver the nation of Israel by defeating this massive army in the Midianites. And again, Gideon does what so many of us tend to do. He kind of drifts back to thinking that it's somehow about him. That somehow it's about what I can or what I can't do. And so Gideon gives his all to basically collect and round up the biggest army he possibly can build. And he does a pretty good job. He actually rounds up 32,000 soldiers. I mean, that's nothing to shake your head at. I mean, that's pretty impressive, really. And yet, but here's the thing. Here's what you got to get, is that in verse 16, before we get to this, God actually makes a promise. Again, after he sits there and says, go in the strength you have, the angel would go on to clarify and basically said, the Lord said to him, I will be with you. Again, the strength that Gideon was going to find to step into this victory wasn't in his ability, but it was in God's ability. It says, I will be with you. And it says, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. So the promise here that he gives to Gideon is like, listen, you're basically going up against one person. Now take that context. Here's the promise, is that you're going to be fighting against one person. And yet what does Gideon do? He rounds up 32,000. Now, I don't know, not a mathematician, but doesn't that seem like a little bit of overkill? Like, I'm going to 32,000 to take on one, right? But that's what we do, though, right? When we're living in insecurity, it never feels like we have enough. So we try to kind of tap into these false securities, these false sense of strength. We try to build up and try to build our security by having a bigger house or having, making a bigger name for ourselves in our career or having more of this or more of that. And again, it's kind of in that context that this story starts to make sense. Because if you just read it on the surface, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Because again, he starts off with 32,000, but remember, the promise was, hey, you're going to be like fighting against one person. And so he comes up to Gideon, and he's like, Gideon, God here speaking, it's like, we got a little bit of a number problem here. And he can imagine Gideon like, yeah, you're right. Like, I got 32,000. We're going against 135,000. Yeah, we could use a few more troops. You were right. I'm glad, God, that you see the same problem that I see. And yeah, it's interesting. What God does is he goes, you know what, Gideon, again, you're right. We've got a numbers problem. So here's what I need you to do is I need you to basically tell any of those that are scared and don't want to fight that they can go home. And Gideon's like, what? Like, what? Because again, I thought this was about what I thought you said to go in the strength I have, right? My abilities, my skills. To let go of, that many truths. I mean, all right. So he goes, and you're kind of expecting like a Braveheart scene moment, right? Like you kind of expect that he's going to put it out there and say, hey, guys, look, if you're nervous about fighting, you can go home. And I'm sure Gideon was hoping for this too, that they would somehow, again, have that Braveheart moment where they'd be like, no! If you leave, I will bleed with you, Gideon.